Okay, so you know when you hop on airplanes and you do the small talk thing, when you and the person next to you, when you're about to share a very small space for a couple of hours, and you just try to establish that, like, we're okay with each other, we're not going to hurt each other, or something like that. And you do this thing like, oh, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Ohio. Oh, my brother-in-law is from Ohio. And you kind of establish that everyone's going to play nice. Usually those conversations will have something to do with, oh, where are you headed? Why are you going there? And often something that will come up is, oh, what do you do? Well, I learned a long time ago to be somewhat dishonest in those introductions, frankly. My doctoral degree, my training was in the title of my subfield was religion, ethics, and politics. And I tend to focus really on the relationship between religion and politics. But early in my graduate study, I learned that many of my airplane neighbors would be somewhat distressed when I told them that I studied religion and politics and the relationship between them. They would either respond with like some look of utter disgust or confusion,
Recoil in
or
horror.
yes, exactly, or withdraw to their, space, I don't know, 2 extra inches farther from me. Um, and so I learned to say instead, "Oh, I study ethics," because when I say when I introduce myself that way, people say, "Oh, I love ethics. We could really use some more ethics these days." Um, if I have ever introduced myself as someone who studies religion and politics, rarely will anyone ever say, "Oh yeah, we need more religion and we need more politics." And certainly we don't need more of the relationship between the two. Okay, let's be clear. There's lots of different reasons for this. And one of the many reasons that folks get nervous about my self-presentation as a scholar of religion and politics is because there is an idea that has possessed many Americans in our day that religion and politics are like oil and water. They do not, or they should not ever be mixed. And there's a rich history behind that idea, only a small fraction of which we'll be able to get into in this episode. Um, in today's episode of Possessed, we will be exploring the histories and the presences today of ideas that haunt us. And the idea that we're going to be exploring today is this commonplace idea that religion and politics ought not intermingle. And we're going to do that by focusing on civil disobedience. Many of America's national heroes took themselves to be engaging in civil disobedience, in practice, if not in name. Um, Many high schoolers are required to read Henry David Thoreau. And of course, across the country, we celebrate Martin Luther King Day. Both of these folks were religious civil disobeyers. But the tradition that these thinkers are located in also draws a lot from this old religious idea that was actually once suggested as a motto for the United States, that, quote, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God.
Hmm.
To get a better sense of the history of this idea, of its strengths and its shortcomings, we're going to be talking with one of the foremost experts on civil disobedience today, on its origins and its well-known advocates. Alex Livingston, welcome to Possessed.
Hi, thanks for having me, Mary. It's a delight to be here.
Oh, it's such an honor to have you. Would you do us a favor and give us a little bit of a background about the subject of civil disobedience, about Gandhi and MLK and other contemporaries?
Okay, great. So let me start by saying maybe something really quick about what civil disobedience is, because it's one of these elastic terms we use in all sorts of ways to encompass a lot of different things. So civil disobedience is a form of protest, but not all protest is civil disobedience.
Mhm.
So we all have various constitutionally protected rights of speech and assembly, and exercising those usually is not an act of civil disobedience. An
Mhm.
act of protest becomes civil disobedience when it breaks the law. That's the critical element. It's disobedient to the law. So, as one scholar put it, civil disobedience isn't just done, it's committed, right? It's the kind of thing that sends one to jail.
Yeah.
So, this leads to a series of puzzles. The first being, why would you ever allow this in a democratic society? Forms of principled law breaking, conscientious law breaking. It seems like criminal conduct, and we have criminal procedures for that. And yet, we think there are cases where principled conscientious lawbreaking is not simply acceptable or something we should tolerate, but even a democratic good, right? So what's the
Hmm.
difference that makes a difference between criminal disobedience and civil disobedience? One of them we think doesn't have a rightful place as a democratic practice, the other we do. So this leads to a series of puzzles of political philosophy and law, trying to square
Yes.
civil disobedience and conscience with the claims of the rule of law or democratic majoritarianism. And there are different ways of doing this. We can talk about it, but it usually involves something like a commitment to nonviolence or accepting the legal punishment or so on or so on or so on, right? It has to be civil in a particular kind of way. Okay, that debate comes back with the first wave of Black Lives Matter and these debates about the security state and surveillance. And those debates didn't look back to the 90s in that moment about alter globalization. They didn't look up to the 1980s and thinking about ACT UP, but really back to the 1960s
Yeah.
and the civil rights movement. That became a real touchstone, both in scholarly and in popular discussions about the legitimacy of lawbreaking and a body of scholarship in philosophy and law that developed around it was kind of wrestling with these puzzles of legitimacy. And many of us found that literature kind of wanting in all sorts
Yeah.
of ways. It didn't seem quite adequate to our moment. We seem to live in a very different world, marked by digital surveillance, militarized policing, mass incarceration, quote unquote post racism.
Yeah.
And it wasn't clear what there was to learn from that literature. And yet, at the same time, it had an incredible presence in the literature. You couldn't argue about Black Lives Matter without invoking the civil rights movement. Or better yet, the American public sphere, it was very hard to have that argument without invocations of King or of the sit-ins and the standards of appropriate protest that people drew from that. So
Well, and
this
that certainly remains the case today,
it
right?
absolutely
Like,
remains the case
yeah.
today. But this really sparked a pretty wide debate, what we can now call like the new civil disobedience debates, of people on the one hand thinking about what are alternative frameworks that are adequate to this moment to very different kinds of protests, whether they're about climate change or surveillance, but also people looking back to that moment in a new light and asking
Yeah.
what we might learn from it that isn't exhausted by our conventional stories we tell about the 1960s. My work kind of fits on that side of the equation.
Okay, so if I'm getting this right, you're thinking about this question about how civil, in the one sense, should civil disobedience be, right? From what I understand, there's all sorts of different ways that people use the word civil when they're talking about civil disobedience.
Uh,
One is just like maybe as a synonym for civic, like civic disobedience. This is something that citizens do. And another way that people often mean civil disobedience is like the nice kind of disobedience, right? When you are willing to take on whatever punishments might come to you, just deal with it because that's what it means to be a principled person, you know. So play nice in your objections to what the state is doing. Um, am I getting that right?
that's right.
Yeah, yeah, good. Um, okay, so can you can you give us a little bit of a sense of why um civil or civic disobedience is so important in US history? I mean, for people who have heard that phrase bandied about in the context of protests against George Floyd or even more recently, this like kind of reigning ideal of what you should do if you're going to be engaging in civil disobedience. Um, who are the like American figures that folks often have in mind? And why do we like value them? Why is that such a part of American political cultural DNA?
Yeah, that's great. So, I on the one hand, there's a very straightforward story about that,
Yeah,
and the straightforward story is one someone like Hannah Arendt offered in the 1970s in an essay called Civil Disobedience, where she says civil disobedience takes place around the world, but it is primarily American in origin and substance. She says other countries don't even have a word for it, which is of course ridiculous, but she says that. And for her, it's an artifact of the long revolutionary tradition in the United States that goes back to the Declaration of Independence and the struggles of the late 18th century. So figures like Henry David Thoreau made similar arguments in thinking about abolitionism. Thoreau really tried to reinvoke the revolutionary traditions of the 1770s, 1780s as a way of justifying and legitimating forms of resistance to the federal government in the crisis over slavery. People like Martin Luther King famously described the Boston Tea Party as the first act of civil disobedience and kind of folded what was happening in the 1960s into this much longer story. And there's a body of scholarship that tells this story, that it's an American tradition. It starts in the colonial period and it continues more or less lives on continuously for the next couple hundred years. So that's one way we tell that story. And major markers, like you said at the beginning, are Thoreau and King. We can populate that as an ever wider list as we like. But abolitionism and civil rights are two important chapters in that story.
And
Okay,
maybe suffragism too, right?
maybe suffragism too,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
But more the British suffragism,
Mhm.
although less civil. The Pankhursts were anything but civil. But interesting. But there's another story you could tell, or you could ask how we came to tell that story about civil disobedience. And it's
Hmm.
notable that Thoreau aside, it's largely a story shaped in the 1960s itself. It's the story people like King told, and scholars around King told, and scholars who came to political consciousness in that period told about the place of their contemporary moment in a larger American story. And to think about why there might be something kind of odd about that is if you go back just a couple decades, um, it was entirely common for Black intellectuals, people like W.E.B. Du Bois or E. Franklin Frazier, to look at the nonviolent campaigns of someone like Gandhi and say those would never work in the United States. It's a
Hmm.
fundamentally foreign tradition. It depends on religious traditions, Hindu religious traditions that are not indigenous to the United States. It would not travel to American soil. And they also said, we don't have the happy fortune of fighting the British. We're fighting white Southerners. And they are more murderous and tyrannical than the British. And nonviolence would never sway them in the way Gandhi imagined, where we're up against lynch mobs and other forms of repression. So there's a sea change that happens in just a few decades in thinking about this tradition of nonviolence and its place in the United States. And why does that happen? Well, I think there's two reasons. So the first has to do with just the intellectual context of the civil rights movement itself. Identifying civil disobedience with an American tradition going back to the 19th or 18th century was a very serviceable way of resisting and diffusing the charge of communism that
Hmm.
Black activists faced. So you have even people like A. Philip Randolph, who proposes the first mass act of civil disobedience, the March on Washington, um, claiming that this is an American tradition in the 40s. It's a very unusual thing to have done in the 40s, but it's very much common sense by the 60s. And it's a way of linking the demands of the Black freedom struggle with certain creedal stories about the American state, to make the claims of a racial minority synonymous or identical with that of the nation as such, right? So it's not the freedom of a particular group, but of all Americans that's at stake
Right.
here.
Well, and if
Um,
you're a real patriot, right,
mhm.
you'll join us, right? Because that's what it is to be an American, is to be willing to engage in this kind of protesting or in this civil disobedient kind of act or movement.
That's exactly right. And there's another layer to it, which has to do with a certain story about the Constitution that often lives in the background of debates about civil disobedience. So one story about the civil rights era that people like King told was that it was the culmination of a creedal story of constitutional development.
Mm.
Principles of human equality announced at the founding were realized historically over time. And it was only with the not just the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendment, but its realization in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that that promise of the 1770s finally comes into fruition, right? That the Constitution realizes this long promise. Now, that's a story that all of a sudden can look back and tell the whole history of the United States as a history of creedal constitutional development, as a series
Yeah,
of values that live
so it's
on.
like progressive, and to be that history is progressive and moving toward, a more perfect union, this sort of thing. And in order to fully realize that, we need more people to be engaging in this civic or civil disobedient movement, is the idea.
That's that's right. But the story, like that's a very familiar story about American nationalism,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
those
yeah.
civil disobedience, they grow up together and they have a
Yes.
complicated relationship with each other.
Yeah.
Both with stories about American exceptionalism and about the Constitution. Um, Now, there's a much wider story about revolt and dissent in the United States. Much of it very uncivil in all sorts of ways, but not necessarily undemocratic. And I think this idea of civil disobedience, it's a very paradoxical idea, civil disobedience, really takes shape at a particular moment, which is quite distinct from the 1930s or the 1890s, really even the 1770s, and has a much shorter lifespan in the US than we usually think. So I
Yeah.
think we want to historicize it. But that said, it's our language now, for better or for worse,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So I think on the one hand, you want to resist the idea this is a very old American tradition going back centuries and centuries, and at the same time saying that we are the inheritors of this tradition today, of this language today. And we can't but invoke texts like Letter from a Birmingham Jail when we have debates about protests on college campuses, for example,
Yes.
for better or worse.
That really strikes home to me, that point you made that hadn't occurred to me before about how much the civil disobedience narrative is really tied to this progressive politics or left-leaning politics. Because as I'm thinking through my head, okay, what are the big sorts of things that come to mind as acts of civil disobedience? I don't think about, the secessionist movement. I don't think about the January 6th insurrection.
Yeah.
Yet these are all arguably forms of civil disobedience. Well,
Not
they're
the
involved
yes.
moments
Yes.
that could be construed as civil disobedience, depending on what you mean by that
Yes.
term.
Yes.
But people self-consciously, intentionally breaking the law
Yes.
in the service of trying to protest because they think that that law is unjust. But we have a very particular crafted narrative
Yes.
of which one of those counts as civil disobedience and which ones don't.
Yeah, right.
That's exactly
Yeah,
right.
and it's probably important to note, I mean, just given the theme for today on the relationship between religion and politics, both of those that you just named, the secessionist movement and the January 6th movement act,
Insurrection.
yeah,
Yeah.
the act of insurrection, were both highly religiously inflected too. So this is
Yeah.
I mean, it's important to name that religion is playing a role in all sorts of these kinds of conversations between movement leaders on all sorts of different sides, for good and for ill, we might want to say. There's no like clear kind of line. I mean, my sense is that, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Alex, but my sense is that a big part of the kinds of question you're asking, it goes back to that difference between civil disobedience as civil because it's a citizen's duty, and civil because it's nonviolent or polite or whatever, other modifier. I know that this is a part of the conversation is, can you engage in violent civil disobedience? Does that, fairly belong to that category? And there's plenty of history of violent, at least self-identified civil disobedience as religiously informed. Yeah, so that it's very complicated on that side of things too.
Yeah, great. So, you know, like I said a moment ago, civil disobedience is a paradoxical concept, and we shouldn't lose sight of the paradox. Those two words
Yeah.
should not go together. So, civility invokes rule following, decorum, politeness, self-restraint, and disobedience is the antithesis of all of these things. Rule
Yeah.
Mhm.
breaking, loudness, disruption, confrontation. And
Well, and
yeah.
and and a right a questioning, a calling into question the very laws that you're supposed to be obeying, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so even on the civil as the citizen's duty side, not the play nice, be polite side, even there that's paradoxical, right? Because shouldn't isn't like the thing that citizens ought to do is to be like an obedient member of the society in which they live, right?
hmm
Yeah.
That's right. So you
Sorry.
can think about like civil disobedience as illegal political participation, right?
Mhm.
It's which is so you have another layer of paradox because what's the basis of law? Popular sovereignty. It's a direct act of popular sovereignty, but we are also committed to the rule of law in all sorts of ways, and we have to kind of negotiate that. So I don't think you ever. So my take is that this is not a question of getting the theory right that holds all these things together, but occupying the tension between them. So
Yeah.
you can have a vision of civil disobedience, which is really marked by decorum, politeness, but not a lot of disobedience. Uh,
Yeah.
so this is a certain sanitized story of the life of Martin Luther King that's held up really as a disciplinary example more than anything to say you're not doing it right. So it's an impossible standard that kind of recedes as you approach it. Or you
Which
can have,
Cornell West, if I recall correctly, calls the Santa Clausification of Martin Luther King. Yeah.
that's right. So, or you could have accounts of disobedience with no sense of civility whatsoever. And that might seem more attractive, but let's think what are two elements of civility we want to hold on to? So, one, mutual respect that we owe each other, both as citizens and as human beings, and the kind of obligations that entails. But also the idea of kind of ongoing democratic cooperation, that whether we like it or not, we live together and we have to find a way to live together even if we are fighting over the terms of our coexistence, even if that's the face of hierarchies of power, even if that's working through long histories of oppression, right? At the end, we want to be neighbors.
Mhm.
And the forms of resistance that we occupy now are not disconnected to that future, right? So we want them to be constrained in certain kinds of ways that allow the possibility of coexisting as equals. So I think that's the burden of navigating this gray zone between civility and disobedience, democracy and law. And it's going to look different in different cases as to how it plays out. Um, okay, your question about violence. Yeah.
Did you want to ask something first?
Oh,
I'm focused on the beginning when you started off. It was
Yes.
about this idea that religion and politics are oil and water or shouldn't mix. Or in this case, like kerosene
And a light, a lighter.
yes, and a
Yeah,
flame or something like
yes.
that. So could I get a little bit more detail about like how was religion? You said that a lot of these were religiously motivated. I see that in Martin Luther King, I think. I'm not familiar with a lot of the ways that religion has been used in this. Is that the right analogy that religion is like kerosene to the fire?
Yeah,
Or
I mean, let me ask you, Alex. I mean, I think it feels like the violence might be the real kerosene or the like
mm,
that debate when you bring that into religion and politics, that's when things get really explosive. So maybe it would be good for us to hear a little bit of a sense of what the religious concepts and actors are that are influencing the tradition of civil disobedience as we know it today, even in this importantly genealogized version that you've offered us, like to help us understand how we have the ideas that we do about civil disobedience in the first place. But I'd love to hear a little bit about what the role that religion has played in and the construction of that idea. And then I think that's on the other side of that, then we'll get a chance to talk about violence. Does that sound good?
That sounds good. S- All right. So let me give you the kind of Holy Trinity account of the history of civil disobedience. And then we can kind of pull out from there. So who is the Holy Trinity? Thoreau, Gandhi, King. And Thoreau, not clearly a religious thinker. He has a secular account of conscience and his obligations to conscience. Um, he argues in Resistance to Civil Government, which is an essay that is posthumously retitled as Civil Disobedience, not a term he ever uses. And it's interesting to think about why it was retitled that. It was retitled that in the wake of the Civil War. And I think because Resistance to Civil Government sounded too secessionist by his later editors for just the reasons Matt suggested. So civil disobedience sounded genteel in a certain kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
So it already starts with a fuzzy genealogy, with a questionable genealogy.
Yes.
So Thoreau is uh, a secular individualist of the Jacksonian period, but he's also a romantic spiritualist. And there are questions as to how to think about the seemingly absolutist commitment to personal principle he advocates in that essay with this more romantic, redemptive story about communion with nature. In
Mhm.
many cases, politics seems to be an obstacle to that for Thoreau. So there's a question as to how those hang together.
Lots
It's
of
much,
puzzles today, Alex.
yes, well, it's not a lot of answers, but a lot of puzzles. So next we have Gandhi. Gandhi presents himself in for most of his career as an orthodox religious mystic or religious ascetic, a sannyasi. He ornamented the Indian nationalist movement in the 20s and 30s with Hindu imagery and Hindu myth, but his own views were highly idiosyncratic and unorthodox. He was anything but orthodox. It was a combination of Jainism, Sermon on the Mount, Thoreau, Tolstoy, 19th century individualist anarchism. It was really distinctively just Gandhi. And yet he could portray it as a very orthodox religion. But the fact that it was so highly idiosyncratic is illustrated by the fact that he was murdered on the grounds that he was a threat to Hinduism, and that the message of nonviolence he was advocating was a threat to Indian Hindus and Hinduism more broadly. And then there's King. King is a Baptist minister. He holds a PhD in systematic theology. He delivers sermons pretty much every week at Dexter Avenue in Montgomery and Ebenezer in Atlanta. So religion or spirituality, let's say, if we want to pull Thoreau in, has some role to play, but a complicated role. It's the most
Yeah.
direct with King, I think. King really articulates his account of civil disobedience, of the Black freedom struggle in biblical terms, again and again and again, reaching back to Exodus, reaching back to prophetic idioms, arguing for equality on the grounds of our dignity as being made in the image of God. It's looser with Thoreau and Gandhi. It's more seemingly almost rhetorical for Gandhi. And Thoreau, it's actually just an interpretive puzzle as to how it all hangs together.
Can I interrupt for one quick second?
Of
So,
course.
what is the Christian justification for civil disobedience that King would use?
Well, and I think Thoreau even is drawing on William Lord Garrison's accounts of the way to respond, and who is a preacher in the 19th century, a famous preacher and abolitionist, founder of an abolitionist newspaper. Yeah, but it may be good to get that account out there.
Why does it make you a good Christian to break the law?
So for Garrison, it makes you a good Christian to break the law because the law is contaminating. You have to purify yourself of the sin of a political and social organization tainted by slavery. And that takes the form of refusing all worldly authority. He argues for the secession of northern states. And Thoreau rejects this. Thoreau um, on civil disobedience says, "I'm not a no government man, but a better government," right? And he's talking about the
Mhm.
Garrisonians. So he
Mhm.
rejects the Garrisonians as being of African kind of otherworldly religion that sees being a good Christian as standing apart and not trying to reform existing political institutions. Thoreau is a critic of reform movements in all sorts of ways, but he sees what he's doing as a kind of democratic practice of reaching out to his fellow citizens and swaying their conscience. Why is breaking the law a matter of being a good Christian? So there's two ways you might answer this in King. In Letter from a Birmingham Jail, the 1963 epistle he writes while in solitary confinement in the Birmingham campaign, he makes a natural law argument.
Yeah.
He draws on people like Augustine and Aquinas, and he says, an unjust law is no law at all. That is to say, a law, a positive law, an enacted law that doesn't accord with a higher moral law, which is moral or God's law, is not legally binding. It doesn't have an obligatory force. So
That's straight out of Aquinas,
that's
right?
straight out of
Yeah.
Aquinas. But that's not an argument for breaking the law. That's an argument for not following
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
unjust law. And interestingly enough, that's actually he doesn't get it from Aquinas. He borrows it from a lawyer named Harris Wofford, who writes an essay on Brown v. Board through Aquinas and Augustine, and King just takes it on as his own there. But there's a positive argument King makes. It's kind of between the lines of that essay. Um, um, but it's all over the rest of his writing. And that is, we have a duty to resist oppression. We have a duty to resist oppression because forms of oppression uh, demean and harm the dignity, what he calls the personhood of others. And um, to harm the dignity of others is not just a wrong to them, but a wrong to God, because they are made in God's image. And in some sense, for King, participate in God's historical realization. So it's a matter of positive obligation to remove those obstacles to a world of full love and neighborly concern that we owe each other. So I have a duty to love you. I cannot love you in a segregated society fully, and therefore segregation must be abolished to create the conditions of full Christian love.
Huh. It just draws it when you tell it that way, it makes me see just how selective we are when we tell our story about the history of civil disobedience, about which cases we select as being emblematic of civil disobedience and which get kind of shunted to the side, and perhaps how arbitrary that story is. If civil disobedience is where Christians refuse to follow laws because they are unjust according to their religion, civil disobedience includes people blocking entrances to abortion clinics. It includes
Yes.
people refusing to issue gay marriage
Yes.
licenses.
Yeah.
But those aren't what we usually think of
As
when we
civil
have as
disobedience.
cases of civil disobedience.
Yeah.
So there's a really interesting selection there.
Although I think remarkably, I think there's a growing movement in a lot of circles to try to pitch those things as civil disobedience. So this is why, for example, one of the biggest nonprofits, a pro-life nonprofit that's trying to restrict access to abortion, is the Susan B. Anthony Center, right? That's borrowing on the kind of reputation of someone who was not as active as their British counterparts, but Anthony was. I mean, I think she's quoted in the Perry book on civil disobedience as like just an example of yet another person who is saying, no, I can't obey your law if that violates what I understand to be the higher law that I am going to follow.
Yeah.
that I have to subordinate this positive law, this, law of the federal government to.
And
Yeah.
that's
So yeah.
Well, I think you're exactly right that there's something really arbitrary about the examples, and this is where the story about the Constitution comes in important
Mm,
ways, because it's framing which cases we think are appropriate or genuinely civil, and those are ones that are fulfilling a kind of constitutional promise over time. But to come back to one of Mary's earlier points, like there's an element of religion there too, right? There's a kind of civil religion. About constitutional reverence
yes.
and its own sacred character that's infusing these debates in ways that we don't really attend to. So you're exactly right, Matt, that, allowing each Christian on their own conscience whether to obey the law or not is a fraught proposition, let's say.
Anarchy or
Yeah.
theocracy or something bad.
Well, I mean, but what's fascinating though is I don't know if you're familiar with this history, but so in the late 80s, there was I'm sure you are, Alex. In the late 80s, there was a man who uh what he smoked peyote or whatever, and then was let go from his job because he had participated in an indigenous religious practice.
Mhm.
And Scalia decides, okay, listen, we can't overturn this because then every person would be a law unto themselves.
Mhm.
Like conscience, we can't do that. This is the worry that you have, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Congress responds with I think it was like 98 to with and then two abstentions with the original RFRA, the what is it, Religious Freedom Restoration Act in 1993. And the whole idea was I mean, everyone from the ACLU to like some of the like focus on the family all agreed that what had happened in that Scalia decision was hard, that we need to have space for precisely the act of someone's religious and conscientious involvement, that violates, to not make latitude for that would violate the Constitution precisely in the way that Alex is drawing us to. And so we created the first the Congress in 1983 created the first RFRA, which has now been replicated in a number of states and used to do exactly what you were talking about, to allow folks to not make cakes for same-sex weddings. Or I think one of those cases was a web designer, to allow for the Hobby Lobby case, right, in which a religious the religious leaders of a corporation were not required to offer healthcare to women. So it's really interesting because there was such strong response to the Scalia decision that no, but we need to make spaces for people's conscientious objection to something I'm going to engage to use a drug that is a controlled substance if that's part of my religious commitments. How you handle this is really, really tricky. What might it mean to make everyone a law unto themselves? But also there's a danger in constraining people's ability to do the things that would accord with their own religion. Like, I don't know, trying to desegregate the South. This is really the hard stuff. Okay, so but my sense is this is exactly where the violence part comes in. So, what were you going to say
Okay,
something else?
before we get to violence though, what I really like about that example is it brings us back to the Constitution again, and the
Yeah,
ways that these religious arguments for civil disobedience are never freestanding. They always hook up with the American Constitution in certain kinds of ways. So King was charged with just that argument by
yeah,
people like segregationists by Kilpatrick, even the Supreme Court in Shuttlesworth v. Birmingham, 1967, where King violates an injunction. And they argue no one can be a judge in their own case. This would be a society of anarchy if we
yeah.
accepted justification. So King always makes these Christian arguments, but then has to frame them back into the Constitution. But that's the same sort of moves you're seeing in Hobby Lobby in a very different constitutional politics, a very different constitutional moment that should upend any familiar story or any easy story we have about the natural liberal progress and development of the American Constitution.
Yeah. Yeah, so it calls into question the progressive, and by progressive, I don't mean like liberal, but progressive as in it's getting better and better all the time, more perfect union stuff.
So just to take stock of this question about the relationship between civil disobedience and religion, you can have civil disobedience without religion, and there's been a lot of instances of that, but religion often comes into play. And religion can have a tendency to maybe sometimes amp up the civil disobedience. And it also connects it to the Constitution because there's a constitutional guarantee to freedom of religion. So when religion comes into play, now there's some sort of deeper law basis for the civil disobedience. So the question is, wow, isn't it contradictory that it's somehow the right thing to break the law? And the answer is, well, it's breaking this law, but it's consistent with the natural law given by God, and it's consistent with the Constitution, because this is part of my religious freedom, is that I don't want to bake a cake for the gay wedding.
Well, and I think even so, even more than that, I'm just going to even intensify what you've just said, Matt. The idea is it's going to make it possible, at least for King, it's going to make it possible to make the Constitution look more and more like God's law or the higher law, right? It's going to enable the Constitution to better and further conform to some greater like moral objective truth. That's what the progressive that progressive view of it's getting better and better all the time. It's getting closer and closer to the morally objective truth that people should be treated equally and that sort of thing. But I also want to note, I mean, I think that there is at least an invocation of some religious concepts in the at the very outset of the formation of this idea. For example, in Thoreau's original title of that essay is very close to the quote that is often, I think, misattributed to John Knox, one of the founders of a Protestant church, that rebellion to tyrants is resistance to God. And this was suggested to be, I think Jefferson ended up including it in Monticello somewhere. And I think Franklin had recommended that for a motto for the US, that like there is this religious idea that in order to be, to do the right thing, you have a duty to resist, which is now commonplace, and a secularized version of that is commonplace. I think in the very debates that Alex was talking about at the outset about this like obligation to engage in protests when it's appropriate.
I think you meant to say rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Right?
What did I say?
Resistance to God.
Oops. Okay, I meant to say.
Yeah.
No, it's important. Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God.
Yeah.
That in order to do the positive obeying God, that in the context of what you were talking about a second ago, Alex, the what it would be to do like God's will, or to do what God requires us to do, that involves like not just failing to obey a rule that a tyrant might institute, but actually doing the things that's necessary to deconstruct that tyrant's rule.
Overturning the tyrant.
Exactly. And I mean, this is a relatively old idea, or this is, going back to the end of the 16th century, early 17th century. And I think these are concepts that are really informing a lot of the founders. Like we gotta do this, so we can't continue to endure the nonsense of unjust leaders.
Yeah. So it's one thing. So you got one thing is you don't follow the law.
Yes.
Another thing is you self-consciously break the law. But another thing is you start a revolution.
Yes.
You rebel, right? And it's this really strong notion that's being evoked.
Yes.
In that phrase.
Yes. Okay, so we have to talk about violence. I mean, my sense is we've got to talk about John Brown at some point. We have to talk about, the ways in which some civil disobedience has, maybe we need to be careful about the term, because I don't think that John Brown would have ever identified himself as civilly disobedient, but I think he would have likely been very enthusiastic to use that rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God line. That the idea that like what is required of me is to like start a war if I need to start a war in order to do what's morally obligatory. So my hunch is that we got to get to violence.
Okay, let's do it.
Tell me more about Brown.
Yeah. Alex, I think you'd be a good storyteller to tell the story of Brown.
So John Brown is an abolitionist. Most, the vast majority of white and black abolitionists, for that matter, in the 1850s are religious, subscribe to various Protestant sects, and see the slavery as a matter of national sin, and that the redemption of the United States as a community, as a nation, depends on purging the nation of this sin. They disagree about the means by which to do this. So the Garrisonians believe in moral suasion. It's through acts of mutual conversion that we transform the souls of our neighbors such that they see the error of the way and slavery withers away. They do this through petitioning. They do this through newspapers, through the public sphere, through various forms of mass marches or processions and demonstrations. But there's also a violent strain of resistance to slavery, most importantly by enslaved people themselves. Nat Turner's rebellion, another series of rebellions in the early 1830s, really light the terror of violent insurgency for slaveholders across the South, and they see the Garrisonians as aiding and abetting this in various ways. And they have a complicated relationship between the violent resistance of enslaved peoples themselves. They can never offer a full-throated defense of it, except for John Brown. And John Brown is part of that minority that can. John Brown sees this Christian obligation to eradicate slavery as putting obligations on him himself to take up arms against slaveholders. And he does this first in Bloody Kansas, kind of the prelude to the Civil War, where as Kansas is about to be admitted into the Union, there are essentially border skirmishes that turn into a small-scale civil war within Kansas between pro and anti-slavery forces to establish the kind of a democratic majority to decide whether it'll be a slave or free state, and John Brown heads out to Kansas with his sons and essentially leads a series of guerrilla raids there and hacks some men to death with a broadsword. But he's best known for the assault on the Federal Armory in Harper's Ferry. And here, John Brown saw himself as leading, as precipitating a slave uprising across the South by
Yeah, because
attacking.
he's not just taking up arms. He thinks he has to arm other people too.
That's right.
Right? Yeah.
So with funding from some wealthy donors in Boston, he makes hundreds and hundreds of pikes, sneaks them in by wagon, and sees that they need to get rifles and seeks to seize them from the armory with the idea that they'll lead a kind of running guerrilla war up and down the mountain ranges of the East Coast, freeing enslaved peoples on plantations, giving them arms, and kind of leading a rolling guerrilla insurgency. They're immediately captured in Harper's Ferry. Most of his sons are killed there in a shootout and arrested. And he's depicted as a kind of Christ-like figure who is dying for the sins of the nation. He depicts himself that way in various ways. But for him, there is no contradiction between his Christian commitments and obligations and the need to violently eradicate slavery in the United States. And his
in fact, it's not
ardent defenders are people like Thoreau and Emerson, who are kind of secularists, in fact, who have less qualms about doing violence to others as a potential problem for Christian ethics.
I was going to say, and in fact, not just not a contradiction, but I think he sees a very positive correlation, a
Mm.
tie between his religious faith and
Yeah, it's a
his
requirement.
obligation. Yeah, this is redemptive suffering. This is what it takes to make the good things happen. Yeah,
That's right. He says the nation will be cleansed in blood.
yeah. Which
Yeah.
is, I mean, a very biblical language.
Mhm.
So my sense is this is, you mentioned the holy trinity of Thoreau, Gandhi, and MLK. I mean, my sense is there's another trinity here that's religion, politics, and violence that really is the kerosene, as you put it earlier, Matt. The idea that not only am I now licensed by virtue of this idea to violate the law, but it's going to be sanctioned by my most strong existential commitments that are counter to other people's existential commitments, and like that's what I ought to do as per our democratic, or I should say American political culture. That's really intense.
It is really intense. But one of the things that's notable about Brown is that while on the one hand he says, my highest obligation is to God, it's also an obligation to the United States. So he
Totally,
writes an
yeah,
alternative constitution for the United States, and he sees this as a redemptive project of national belonging, even as it is a holy war. And in that sense, like King, he's drawing this connection between his own Christian ethics and certain national covenantal obligations that go all the way back to the motto Franklin suggests for the seal. Resistance to tyrants is obligation to God or is obedience to God, but it's also obedience to America, right? It's
yeah,
not for
right,
God at the expense of to obey God is to obey America,
yeah,
right? So there's this always this link to a kind of civil religion underpinning it, even with Brown.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what do you think, Matt? What do you think, Alex?
Is this an idea that should be exorcised?
Do we
You know,
need to get rid of this?
which idea is it that
Mm.
the religion and politics should be separate or that they should be the same connected? Which one do we want to talk about?
I mean, I, maybe I got this all wrong. Maybe what we should have been talking about all the entire episode was whether or not we need to be exercised of the idea that civil disobedience is a good thing, right? Or that it has to be civil.
Mm.
But surely I think that there are I mean, as we've discussed, there's religious roots of that idea. I mean, for King, I think the way that he thinks that he's going to get outside of the John Brown kind of problem is by saying, I'm going to obey God so much that I'm going to take on whatever is required, including not taking up arms, right? That's going to be a central part of the nonviolent, the nonviolence of the movement. It's going to show how obedient I am to God. But I don't know. I was thinking um, that maybe we should be thinking about whether or not we need to get rid of this idea that our existential commitments or our religious commitments and our political commitments should try to be on. We should put them on the opposite sides of the room or whatever. I don't know.
I come away like I start off with this kind of like if you look at Martin Luther King and you
Yeah,
look at Gandhi, this looks like a really great thing. This looks like a morally good thing. It gave us all of this progress. So I start off thinking, yeah, this is a really great idea. But you have to look at not just how that idea is put into practice when it's people you agree with doing
Hmm.
things you think are good.
uh-huh.
You have to look at all of the instances of the different ways that this can be used to really judge whether that's a good thing. And once I start to expand my scope to include not just Martin Luther King and Gandhi, but all of this other kind of stuff, I start to get a little bit more skeptical about whether this is an idea we should really be getting excited about.
Civil disobedience.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe what we need to be exercised from is this idea that that's,
Romanticizing.
yeah, romanticizing
It's
civil disobedience.
romanticizing civil disobedience around certain cases that
Yeah,
people really like. I think that's something that I would be happy to have less of.
to move on from. What do you think, Alex? Do you think that we need to be rethinking our affection for civil disobedience?
So I think that it's actually more important now than ever to make really full-throated defenses of it, even for
Okay.
cases we don't like. And that is because we're living through a really intensive moment of the repression of protest in the United States, not just in
Mm,
the United States, but certainly in the United States. We're seeing legislation across the country and states taking misdemeanors and transforming them into felonies when protests are involved, particularly if they have to do with um, uh, fossil fuel infrastructure or blocking roads. We have legislation exempting people for criminal liability for running over protesters, and we have the growing militarization and surveillance of police in sort of every corner of our lives. So it's becoming harder and harder to justify any form of protest, even constitutionally protected protest in the United States today. So as much as I think we're right to be very wary to cherry pick, I think we really want to make strong arguments for forms of extra legal, illegal forms of disobedience as needful and beneficial to our democracy. But then the question becomes when, right? And
yeah.
I think
Mhm.
simply listing the examples that we like and saying whether things live up to them or not is not helpful. But then thinking about what do we like about those examples? And one answer might be that they just align with our prior politics. That's not a very good reason.
Yeah.
But perhaps there are some features of them that we find admirable, defensible, and that we would even be willing to put up with pretty uncomfortable protest from people we disagree with if they abided by them in some terms. And this is where I think that tension between civility and disobedience comes into view. In that we don't want just disobedience for disobedience's sake, of course, but we don't want to domesticate it in these very narrow terms either. So for me, I think, one element is trying to think about what it means to show another respect as equals. But I think more importantly is this notion of what would it mean to live together in the aftermath. John Brown has no image of living together with
Right.
anyone in the
Right.
aftermath, right? These are sinners to be purged of this world. But for someone like King, for someone like Gandhi, who's thinking a lot about Hindu-Muslim coexistence in India, the question of like how you live with your former oppressors, how you live alongside someone whose neck you had a boot on for 200 years as equals, right? Like that's a really important question. And the ways that we engage in protests that open up certain kinds of futures as opposed to ones that close them down or foreclose them
Yeah.
by being premised on the idea that is not imaginable, right? I think that becomes a way for thinking about different forms of acceptable protests. And I think that's why nonviolence matters a lot. I think violence closes down that future too readily. Now, there's a lot of things called violence, right? We
Yes. Yeah.
that like civil disobedience is a word that's very elastic. You hurt my feelings, that's violence. You burn down my house, that's violence. You break a sign in front of my yard, that's violence. You punch me in the face. Like they're actually quite different in all sorts of ways. And I think we have to be careful about the ways that we expand that language. John Brown is a clear case. That's an easy
Yeah.
case. Um, Making people uncomfortable is not violence. It's actually a part of the contentious life of a democracy. But I think the interesting case is like something like coercion, because coercion sounds like something you shouldn't do. We should never coerce one another. But pretty much every repertoire of nonviolent protest involves some element of coercion,
Yeah. Right. Right.
whether it's a boycott
Right.
or a sit-in
Well,
or
and coercion can be quite slippery too.
that's. Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one of the ideas we have to exercise, Matt, is the idea. that any kind of act of civil disobedience is going to help along in that progressive view of history.
Mm-hmm.
That all of our, anytime we act according to our conscience, that is going to help, move to the next step. And instead, we have to rethink this history in terms of the possibility that conscientious lawbreaking does sometimes help move us along. And even maybe religiously motivated conscientious lawbreaking can help move us along, as was the case for King and many other actors in the civil rights movement. And yet, we need to exercise ourselves of the idea that means that it's a guarantee that religiously motivated especially, but conscientious lawbreaking will be helpful in terms of creating a more perfect union. That's no assurance that we're moving in the right direction. Yeah.
So I think the case, look, philosophically, the case of religiously motivated conscientious lawbreaking sounds like a really sticky one, but we look on
Yeah.
the ground, it's actually the easier case in all sorts of ways.
Mm,
Because if we look at religiously motivated civil disobedience movements today, who are we talking about? We're talking about the Poor People's Campaign and Moral Mondays, like,
yeah.
Reverend White Barber. We're talking about
Yeah.
Catholic workers,
Yeah.
or we're talking about certain strains of the environmental movement. These are the movements most committed to nonviolence, most
Yeah.
committed to accepting even arrest and imprisonment,
Yeah.
as these movements go. So I think if religion can amp up contention, as Matt said, it can also cool it in all sorts of
Yeah.
ways because there are sort of more principled moral commitments underpinning these than in more opportunistic, strictly power-oriented struggles that you see in a lot of other movements.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alex, and teaching us so much about civil disobedience and its history and its present. We've got a lot to think about, a lot of puzzles to keep playing with in our brains. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Possessed is made possible by a generous grant from the University of South Carolina Humanities Collaborative.